So when typically, when we first come into contact with these kinds of teachings through listening or through reading, this is the first phase of the teaching, when we listen. And many of you all know this is called Shravana. Shravana is the Sanskrit word for hearing or listening. And then we hear the teachings, we hear the concepts. We maybe do some practices or some investigations or some exploration based upon these teachings. And then we think about these teachings. We have doubts, we have questions. And then maybe to resolve these doubts, we need to read some more books or engage with the teachings some more, or ask questions to a teacher, or do some more exploration. And then we get some more answers. And this phase is called manana, which is the Sanskrit word for thinking about the teachings, or contemplating the teachings, reflecting upon the teachings. But when we understand the teachings, when our Shravana becomes perfect, and our doubts are all cleared, and our questions are all cleared, and everything, and even our doubts and questions become cleared through manana, then the teaching starts to work on us. And at this point, we enter the third phase of the teaching, nididhyasana, which means, literal translation is meditation. But it's when we turn within and go into the self. And in this part of the teaching, we shed all the concepts that we've picked up, especially even all the spiritual concepts, which includes the teaching itself, ultimately. And the purpose of the first two parts of the teaching, Shravana Manana, hearing and then contemplating the teachings, is to strengthen our nididhyasana, where we go inwards towards the self, abide as the self, in silence. We forget everything, forget all. This is why in the last part of Advaita Bodha Deepika, which is that wonderful text that gives us an overview of the whole Advaita path. It's also in Viveka Chudamani as well. There's a section between the Manana section and the Nididhyasana section where the guru, the teacher, is telling the seeker, now we give up our vasana for the scriptures. Because when we first encounter the spiritual teachings, we develop a vasana, which is a habitual tendency, and a habitual tendency to read and engage with spiritual teachings. Often it's called sastra vasana. Sastra means the scriptures. Sastra vasana is the habitual tendency to want to read lots of scriptures and texts and books and spiritual teachings. So sastra vasana is very important for most people, especially on the knowledge path, because that's what helps us engage with the teachings. But through engaging with the teachings, through doing our Shravana and Manana, we eventually start to lose, we have to shed that initial habitual tendency that initially was helpful. We have to shed it, and we forget everything. So we start off, in the spiritual journey, we start off with something, which is called ignorance. We start off with something called ignorance. This ignorance is the belief on the body-mind, and everything that is predicated upon that, all the suffering and duality that's predicated upon that, that depends on this root concept on the body-mind, ignorance. So we start off with something, ignorance. This is where a seeker. Then we add something onto that. So we've got one, which is ignorance. Then we come across the teaching, which is a second thing. We add on to that. So now we've got two things. Now we've got ignorance, and we've got more ignorance in the form of the teaching. The teaching, the teacher, these dualities, these other modalities as more ignorance. So we started off with ignorance, and the teaching comes along and it gives us more ignorance. Now we've built up our ignorance even higher. But the content of the teaching is to get rid of everything. So we start off with ignorance. We get a second ignorance called the teaching. The teaching tells us to get rid of both of these, to take us back to zero. Zero is the self. Zero objects. Without the second form of ignorance, which is the teaching, the first form of ignorance persists. So this is the old metaphor of use a thorn to remove a thorn, then throw them both away. Has everyone heard that metaphor? I'll come to you in a second, Arvind. Just want to make sure people know that metaphor. The first thorn is ignorance, and we have this thorn in us already, which is the suffering, the belief, I am the body mind. The second thorn, which is another form of ignorance, is the teaching or the teacher. And this second thorn removes the first thorn of ignorance, and then we have to throw them both away. Otherwise, if we cling on to the teaching, the concepts, we just end up with a new thorn in us, a new form of ignorance. Arvind, yes.
So the statement that the world disappears, is that a literal statement or a figurative statement? Does the world disappear like in deep sleep? Or there are no objects, it's more like a dream kind of disappearance? Or it's just gradations of the same reality depending on your, I guess, the level of establishment in the self or whatever you call it?
This cannot be described. Okay. This is why you get such conflicting descriptions. Some places it will say it's deep sleep, no objects. Other places it will say the objects are there, but they're known to be illusion. None of these are quite right. The secret is to find out through inquiry.
Thank you.
The simplest thing to say is, in realization, all objects disappear. There is just pure non-duality. But that seems like a void. It is what you've always been looking for. It's nothing. It's this total nothingness, total peace, total joy, total love, beyond words, beyond concepts. All I will say, it's your heart's desire. But to the mind, it seems like a void. But actually, it's everything you're looking for.